Hey, this is pretty special for me. This is wonderful. So tonight, this afternoon, we're going to talk about the history of the industrial workers of the world. I'm going to assume most of the people here have heard about who the Wobblies were, and we're going to also talk about who they are.
Who they were, and they're going to find out who they are.
We are indeed.
Yeah, so at the moment, the Brisbane branch is the biggest branch in Australia. The last 12 months, we've seen unprecedented phenomenal growth. A lot of direct action, a lot of people sort of putting their bodies on the line and their ideas on the line and going out there and supporting workers in different sort of strikes and situations. And our delegate, Fergal, will talk a lot more about the details of what we've done this year. But I guess I just want to briefly say that history is dynamic. It's what you create, what you do here and now then becomes history. So what happened in the past is what ordinary working class people just got up and just went in and did it. And so we're going to hear the details about what they did in the past. Take that information, and I would love to see that applied here and now. Take that energy that exists in the past, that knowledge, and learn from it, and see how we can grow, because we are in a pretty special time right now. There's not just climate change, but there's rebellions and uprisings all around the world. And without a doubt, I guess, if people's been following what's happened in Chile in the last week, on the Wednesday, Chile, the workers called a general strike. The working class in Chile just shut down the economy, and that's powerful. And that's not the only place. Barcelona, I understand, has just done this as well. At the start of the year, there's uprisings everywhere. And so unless the working class are involved and organised, these things fizzle out. There's a history where we win when we're organised and when we stand together in solidarity. And that's kind of a message I'd like to people to think about here, that these aren't just remote actions that happen other places. These are just things ordinary people get up and do and become special themselves by doing it. I'd also, obviously, Australia is a colonised country. We all understand the process of Indigenous occupation. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about just briefly was how special I feel, because I had a chance to work with Uncle Arthur, who was an elder of the Turrbal of the Indigenous people of Brisbane. And it was pretty wonderful hearing lots of different stories, just working with him about the things they did in the past, their traditions and their ideas. And again, that's a situation where you might think it's the past, but no, the colonialism genocide is still a thing. It's still going on. And that's where what we did at Deebing Creek at the start of the year is extra special. We got the workers and all the different unions sort of got out there and defended it against what is basically an act of colonial genocide by the developers who wanted to destroy Deebing Creek for basically suburban expansion. So this is living history. We're doing it. And so, yeah, Fergal, if you'd like to come up.
You won't leave me anything left to talk about if you tell everything. No, so anyway, I don't know if I'm talking into this. Anyway, yeah, no, I'd just like to give an idea of I guess where we've come from as the IWW. I don't know, I think about literally a year ago, meetings were 5 people sitting in Asga's backyard, but to the state where we're at now, we've got about 70 odd members, and again, one of the largest branches in Australia, or if not the largest branch in Australia, and the largest we've been since World War One. Since the IWW was literally, criminalised, persecuted, and jailed and destroyed for its anti-conscription campaigns, and we've kind of turned that situation. It's taken a while yet, but I guess we've kind of been able to sort of, I guess, through a few involvement in different campaigns and stuff like that, we've kind of been able to turn it around from being just I guess in a sense, kind of like a historical anonymity with a few comrades who've been waving the flag, to actually an organisation that is effectively getting involved, intervening and supporting and helping to organise across the class in Brisbane, as well as other branches across Australia. But in Brisbane here, we've been, we've been incredibly supportive of our struggles. Like Asga said, out at Deebing Creek, helping coordinate, organise, using our contacts across the union movement to draw in support, to get support for that struggle, and on the ground, just helping with getting material resources, helping build political support and all that kind of stuff. We also were similarly active in the Chemist Warehouse strike, just helping maintain the picket out there, just being out there in support with other workers, and just being, ready to just up the ante with the cops and stuff like that, and stand alongside other workers, just stick it to cops and that kind of thing. And that kind of stuff has kind of, inspired people, what militant unionism looks like, and across the union movement. And I guess that's kind of the approach that we've been taking, that the IWW, our goal is to be the one big union, to organise across the class. But at the moment, we're all in our own different unions, and how can we all come together to start acting collaboratively with one another across industries and that kind of stuff as militant unionists? And I think that's that was always the spirit of what the IWW was, and that's the spirit of what we're trying to build again now, and what we're kind of doing a good job of doing that, I think, I guess it's just onward from here. We've grown from 5 to 70 odd members in the space of a year. How well can we do the next coming year? Continuing to support struggles like Deebing Creek, continuing to rock up to picket lines and show solidarity out there, and whatever else gets thrown at us, we'll be there. This is just really great as well. Again, I don't know how many people are in here, but again, that we're at this capacity where we're able to have a meeting like this, draw people in, reflect on the history, and then work out, what do we do what lessons can we learn from that history to move on into the future, I suppose. But anyway, I won't ramble on too much. Thank you for listening. If you aren't members of the IWW already, join up now, and agitate amongst your comrades, and let's kind of start bringing the different unions together and working out how we can support each other across industries and that kind of stuff. I'd like to, introduce Bob to Paula to the stage. Paula and Bob to the stage. Bob is going to talk about the IWW in the United States, and then Paula will talk about in Australia. So thank you, comrades.
My name's Bobby Carnegie. I'm a working class activist. In fact, I had a few words with Asgar about that when the first posters went out regarding that. I look at myself as a person who's been involved in the trade union and working class movement for the last 45 years, since I was a very young man, a young boy actually. I don't define it by what trade union positions I may or may not have held over a lifetime, that's for sure. But the main thing, look, first of all, comrades, fellow workers, I'd like to thank you all today for coming. It's great to see that the IWW its ideas and ideals are still alive today, even in the most difficult circumstances. But the circumstances I'm going to reflect upon were much more difficult 100 years ago. And so if we think things were tough now, I want you to reflect on some of the personal stories I'm going to talk about in this very short contribution. The reason that I've picked on the IWW in the United States, it was the home base of the industrial workers of the world. It's from 1905, from its inception, to 1920, when after the Palmer raids it was almost totally wiped out, is that the Wobblies shone like a comet in the sky across the vast expanse of the US labour movement during that period of time. and their hopes, their thoughts and their struggles inspired generations of trade unionists in the United States and also generations of trade unionists all around the world. Fellow workers, my talk today is about the importance of remembering working class activists and not just the leaders. Today's short talk takes in 4 industrial workers of the world activists, each one a working class hero. 2 of the people that I talk about today were lynched. All had spent time in prison, including many, many years. One is, in my opinion, perhaps the finest trade union working class organiser that's been produced in the Western world. His name was Vincent St. John. For 70 years, Vincent St. John lay in an unmarked pauper's grave in Oakland, just the other side of San Francisco. And a Labor Historical Association was doing some research, and they found that this hero of the US working class had died and was buried by the state because he had nothing, and and so they may have now. There's a headstone in Oakland that at least commemorates and shows where a very brave working class person has been buried. All 4 of these names should be remembered, but because they were wobblies, they have been largely forgotten about in the way that we can forget about those on the left of society, that the conservatives who are in charge of our history have done so effectively. This is my tribute to them. I hope these working class fighters and the thousands who have fought the good fight in the labour movement are not forgotten about, but stand as a symbol of hope, pride and inspiration for the oncoming generation of trade union activists who truly believe that an injury to one is a concern of all. And so now I'm just using this iPad, and I'll bring out my notes and we'll talk about these 4 magnificent working class fighters. The first wobbly I'd like to talk about is Wesley Everett. Wesley Everett was an IWW. He was attacked by the American Foreign Legion on November the 11th, 1919, the first year after the armistice. Wesley Everett was a young man. The IWW's hall in Everest in Centralia was raided by the American Foreign Legion. The IWW defended themselves, and three legionnaires were shot dead, and 2 wobblies were also killed. Everett uttered the words when the hall was being attacked. He said, "I fought for democracy in France, and I'm going to fight for it here. The first man that comes into this hall, he's going to get it." And indeed, he did get it. During the evening on November the 11th, Wesley Everett was turned over to a lynch mob by the jail guards, and he was taken to a bridge over the Chalice River in Centralia. He was lynched and then shot. He was hung. The next day his body was cut down and it laid in the river bottom until sunset, where his body was returned to the jail. There it lay with the rope still around its neck, in full view of the IWW members rounded up after the shootings. Later his body was buried in a pauper's graveyard. No one was charged with the crime, even though those involved in the lynching were well known to the townsfolk in Centralia. And this is to follow on about how the state moved against the wobblies. As a result of the shootings, 7 IWW members were sentenced to prison terms of between 25 to 40 years. And the last wobbly was let out of prison in 1939. So they were jailed under criminal syndicalism and under trumped-up attempted murder charges. The next fellow worker that some of you might know about is Ralph Chaplin. Ralph Chaplin's famous because Ralph Chaplin wrote Solidarity Forever, okay? But he was a wobbly. In fact, he was the next great wobbly poet apart from Joe Hill. Ralph Chaplin was born in Kansas in 1887 and his family moved to Chicago in 1893. His family endured a great deal of poverty, and at the age of 7, Chaplin saw workers shot dead during the Pullman strike, which was very famous. It was a great strike in 1891 in the US. Eugene Debs, the great Eugene Debs, led it, who was actually a founding member of the Wobblies in 1905. During that strike, 150,000 workers were on strike for 3 months. 22 were murdered and some 10,000 were arrested during that strike. It was about trying to unionise the railroads. The infant ARU, which had shown the first time in the US about bringing Black Americans into the union movement, their hopes and their ideals were shattered on the bayonets of shoulders. On this, Ralph Chaplin's life was one where he joined the Industrial Workers of the World a bit later than most in 1913, and he was one of the most popular writers in its organisation. As well as editing Solidarity and the Industrial Worker, he wrote poems, songs and pamphlets for the organisation. He also produced a large number of illustrations for journals. He's a hugely talented individual. He reminds me a bit of the Australian version we've got here, Stevie, just there. Okay. Along with Joe, he was the most popular songwriter in the Wobblies. His songs included the Solidarity Forever, as I've spoken about, and also the Commonwealth of Toil. During the First World War, Chaplin opposed the anti-war campaign that was led by Frank Little. There was a split in the Wobblies. People such as the great Big Bill Hayward and Ralph Chaplin opposed the very militant line of Frank Little, who wanted the Wobblies to be very active in the anti-war movement. Chaplin and Hayward felt that if they should use the war to organise workers, not only just to oppose the war, because they felt, and quite rightly, that opposition to the First World War they wouldn't be able to develop a broad consensus amongst the working class, and what would happen is that the full force of the US government would come down upon the Wobblies, and they were quite prescient in that, and certainly it did come down. As I said, Chaplin opposed the war. However, in September 1918, that's 2 months before the end of the war, Chaplin was one of the 165 IWW leaders charged with trying to prevent, hinder and delay the execution of 11 acts of Congress and the presidential proclamations covering the war program. He was found guilty under the Espionage Act and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison and a fine of $20,000. Chaplin had the opportunity when he was out on bail to go to the Soviet Union. Some Wobblies escaped to the fledgling Soviet Union in 1921 when they're out on bail, awaiting trial. People such as Big Bill Hayward, they went to Hayward, who had just got off had got off one of the great trials in American labour history, felt that he couldn't do 20 years in Leavenworth, and he went to the Soviet Union. And he died in 1928, Bill Hayward, and he's actually, today, he's still interned in the Kremlin Wall. Okay. Chaplin got out, was pardoned in 1923, and along with other IWW victims of the federal government. Chaplin's life took lots of different turns. He died in 1961, but he stayed a militant Wobbly all of that time, and he is a person who, really, if we're thinking of working class activists, he's got to be remembered. But you ask people, who's heard of Ralph Chaplin? There's not many. And now I'd like to touch on another hero, a real hero of the working class movement. They all are, but a man by the name of Wesley Everett. Has anyone here heard of the name Wesley Everett? Okay, there's not many. Wesley Everett was a part American native Indian. His brother and him were both Wobbly organisers. Frank Little was a man who lived his life, lived an amazing life. He was engaged in organising lumberjacks, metal miners, migrant farm workers and oilfield workers into industrial unions. Frank Little was very much a political trade union activist. He believed in taking part in the Great Free Speech campaign. He pioneered passive resistance tactics used by the Freedom Riders during the Civil Rights movements. Frank Little first took part in the 1909 Montana free speech fight with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who ended up, Joe Hill wrote the song The Rebel Girl about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. He helped organise lumber workers who had suffered at the hands of the logging company, managers complicit with loan sharks and employment sharks who tricked working men out of their hard-earned money. Next, Frank Little took part in Spokane, Washington, a free speech fight where he was sentenced to 30 days in prison for reading the Declaration of Independence. He suffered in Spokane's frigid Franklin School jail after refusing to work in a city rock pile. Along with his organiser brother Walter and his sister-in-law Emma Harper Little, Frank took part in free speech fights amongst workers in Fresno, California in 1910 and 11, and he played a massive role in organising strawberry pickers and vegetable pickers in the Fresno Valley, which predated the great Cesar Chavez, probably 40 or 50 years. Eventually, Little successfully organised unskilled fruit workers. He also had free speech fight efforts in Kansas City, Missouri, Webb City, Missouri, and Pretoria, Illinois. In August 1913, Little and his fellow industrial worker of the World Union organiser James P. Kennan. James P. Kennan eventually became the leading Trotskyist in the United States. Arrived in Duluth, Minnesota to support a strike of all dock workers against the Great Northern Railroad. In this strike, Frank Little was kidnapped, held at gunpoint outside the city and was dramatically rescued by Union supporters. In 1914, Little was elected a member of the Industrial Workers of the World Central Executive Board. 2 years later, he returned to the Great Lakes, where he organised Superior, Wisconsin dock workers in a strike for better safety conditions and wages. There he was kidnapped once again, severely beaten and mock-hanged. Frank Little was a strong opponent of capitalism after witnessing many late 19th and early 20th century American businessmen use unscrupulous methods to get rich. As a result, he also opposed World War I, which many believed to be a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. While General Secretary Treasurer William Hayward and members of the General Executive Board shared Little's opinions about the war, they disagreed about whether to create an anti-war agitation. When the US joined the war in April 17, Ralph Chaplin claimed that opposing the draft would destroy the unions through government repression, and he was fundamentally right. Although what Frank Little had to do, he had to do, because it was, you're put in a situation, you see workers, workers die in the battlefield, which in a war that they shouldn't be in the first place. Frank Little refused to back down on this, and he argued that the IW is opposed to war in all its forms. We must use all our power to prevent the workers from joining the army. He planned to go to Butte, Montana to support union organising after the spectacular mine disaster in 1917, where 168 men died in a mine fire. Prior to Frank Little's arrival in Butte on July the 12th, 1917, about 1,200 striking mine riders in Arizona were rounded up and deported in New Mexico. Xenophobia, especially against German Americans, pervaded the nation. Mine operators used this volatile atmosphere as an excuse to deport striking workers, undesirables immigrants that were perceived to be a threat. Little had broken his ankle and was not part in the famous Bisbee deportations. This was a time when they rounded up striking workers, put them in rail carts, not much different to what Stalin did, and sent them into the middle of deserts and then let them out and said, you have to make your way home from there. So it was a way of breaking strikes and sending a powerful message to striking workers that the mine owners were stronger than what they were. In the early hours of August the 1st, 1917, 6 masked men broke into Nora Byrne's steel block boarding house where Frank Little was staying. The men initially kicked in the wrong door in the boarding house and when confronted by Byrne claimed to be law officers. Little was beaten in his room and abducted while still in his underwear. He was bundled into a car which sped away. Little was later tied to the car's rear bumper and dragged over the granite blocks of the street. Photographs of his body showed that his kneecaps had possibly been scraped off. Little was taken to the Milwaukee Bridge at the end of the town where he was then hanged from a railroad trestle. The coroner found that Little died of asphyxiation. It was also found that his skull had been fractured by a blow to the back of the head caused by a rifle butt or gun butt. A note with the word first and last warning was pinned to his thigh, referring to earlier vigilantes giving people 3 warnings to leave town. The note also included the number 3777 assigned the vigilantes active in the 19th century in Virginia City, Montana. Some people thought referred to grave measurements. Okay. 3 foot deep, 3 foot wide, 7 feet long, and 77 inches deep. The attorney for the metal and mine workers said after Little's murder that the union had received warnings about Joe Shannon, Tom Campbell, and other men, but no one was apprehended or persecuted for Little's lynching. A number of people have speculated about his murder. Union leaders who saw Little's body after the time insisted that one of the murderers was Billy Yates, a notorious hired thug employed by Anaconda. Anaconda Copper was one of the largest copper miners in the world until it was taken over by Rio Tinto. When Little's body was finally given to his family and to the IWW, an estimated 10,000 workers lined the route of Frank Little's funeral procession, which was followed by 3,500 more people. The funeral is still the largest ever seen in Boots history. He was buried in Boots, Montana View Cemetery. His grave marker says, "Slain by capitalist interests for organising and inspiring his fellow men." Vincent St. John. I think this is the man, whose life was maybe the saddest and maybe, in some ways, it took in the whole canvas of the US working class. And how many people have heard of Vincent St. John? Unless you're a Wobblies nut, you haven't heard of Vincent St. John, and his name should be better known than John L. Lewis, and it should be better known than any Australian Labor leader or anyone else. Vincent St. John was a hugely important and influential member of the IWW in its early years. During the 109 years of existence, well, it's longer now, it's 115 years of the existence of the industrial workers of the world, there have been many organisers and members whose name has become prominent within the union. Some were respected and few have been hated, but others triggered feelings that are a mixture of the two. But arguably no one has been as admired as an IWW as Vincent St. John. Nicknamed the Saint, St. John was born to parents in an Irish ethnic background in 1876. For the next 15 years, his family moved around frequently, residing in 4 different states before finally settling in Colorado in 1895 when St. John was 19 years of old. In Colorado, he began working as a miner and union organiser. Within 5 years, at the age of 24, he was elected president of the Western Federation of Miners Local in Telluride. The next year, the Telluride Local was involved in a hotly contested strike. One of the mine owners organised an anti-union citizens' alliance to oppose striking miners. Scabs were armed and deputised by police. In response, St. John ordered 250 rifles and 50,000 rounds of ammunition for the union. As the strike dragged on, a confrontation between Scabs and strikers occurred in which shots were fired and a few men were killed. At the end of the battle, the Scabs withdrew and the strikers occupied the mines. Foreshadowing the sit-downs and occupations that were first done by the IWW in 1906, it was then followed up by the CIO in the 1930s when the great auto and steel industries were organised. After the strike died down a year later, St. John was shot in the street and his hand was crippled forever. At the 1906 convention of the IWW, he was elected as General Secretary. For the next several years in his position as General Secretary of the Wobblies, he helped shape the union in a more radical fashion and saw the union grow 10 times in membership. Many of the most famous strikes, campaigns, organising drives and strategies happened in the pre-World War era, when St John was the General Secretary. He also acted as one of its public faces, making many public calls in the pages of the union publications such as Solidarity to reinforce free speech fights in places like Spokane and Duluth. In 1914, possibly exhausted after years of organising battles and factional fights, he resigned as General Secretary and went to the southwest to be a simple prospector. Despite this, he was still rounded up in 1918, and during the US government's wartime persecution of the Wobblies, and he was jailed for 20 years. And he was released in Leavenworth along with Ralph Chaplin in 1923. Upon his release, he apparently rejoined the IWW, which was in the middle of a conflict with the newly established Communist Party of the United States, which was trying to win Wobblies to their party. He sided with the NECPers, which would be natural for a man like Vincent St John. Very little is known about what happened to St John between his immediate release and his death at the age of 56 in San Francisco. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Oakland, which eventually was given a proper headstone nearly 70 years later. Look, team, I'm not going to take up any more time. I've already taken up enough, which is more than I thought. But these 4 stories, I hope, give us all inspiration. They also give us time to reflect. And they also give us the time to think that that there are working class people everywhere whose names aren't so well remembered, who have given so much to the struggle. It's not the big name that you see emblazoned in a boardroom or emblazoned or a statue or anything else. It's the people who fight the good fight for all of us. That is the most important thing, okay? So that's my little tribute to some great people. Thanks.
Greetings, fellow workers. It's good to see so many people here today, and I'd like to thank Bob for that history, all of which is a very important part of the story of the industrial workers of the world. And I would just like to add that if anybody's interested, Vincent St John's History and Structure and Methods of the IWW is one of the best documents that ever written. That was, for me, that's one of the key things about Vincent, is what a good writer and a good theorist he was. This is not to mention Ralph Chaplin. So Asger invited me here today to talk a little bit about the IWW in Australia, just to follow on from there. And, to be honest, it's not actually my area of expertise. I am actually, if you look at my academic career, I suppose you would call it, I became very interested in American social history. That's how I started. And I sort of started with the civil rights movements in the 1960s and the revolutionary movements in the 1970s, worked my way backwards to the Haymarket anarchist. And when I started and completely failed to do a PhD, what I was actually looking for was internationalism. And I think this was part of the context of Australian history, where we're looking at a post-Howard era where, and I'm sure you're all aware of the kind of reflexive military kind of nationalism that was kind of being perpetrated by the Howard government, and academics here call it the history wars, which the Liberals pretty much won. And because my family are a union family who come from Melbourne, and communists several generations back, I was sort of aware of another side of the story, and so I started looking for examples of internationalism. And I started finding them amongst maritime workers in a lot of ways. So there's a British working class historian who he said once, doing working class history is not like doing, political history or military history where the sources are all organised for you, all laid out in front of you, and they're a question of interpretation. With working class history, it's mostly hidden history. So you ask a question and then you try to find a way to answer it. You try and find any way to answer it that you can. And for me, a lot of those answers have come from workers talking about their own history. And mainly that's oral histories, and that's what I got interested in, was the way that workers described and interpreted their own stories and their own histories. And so that brings us to Australia, because there's a very famous wobbly in Australia named Tom Barker. Now, Tom Barker is the wobbly that everybody knows. Really, he's the most, if you look at Australian labour history, he's quoted everywhere. And that's partly because in the 1960s, there was an young Australian graduate from the university in Canberra who discovered that Tom Barker was still alive and living in London, trekked over there on a boat, hired some extremely laborious 1960s recording equipment and got his oral history down. And put it into a pamphlet called Tom Barker and the IWW. And this relates to Brisbane history too, and I want to know if anybody here knows anything about this, because that pamphlet was republished in 1994 by a Brisbane Wobblies. So I don't know if anyone's aware of that particular resurgence of the Wobblies. And this is, we never really die. There's always some of us around. And so I have had a copy of that pamphlet for a very long time. And then I was doing a random keyword search in the National Library, and I discovered a lovely pamphlet called The Story of the Sea. And it came from a time when, after the 1920s, when the Wobblies in the United States were smashed by the Palmer raids and by the massive, there were hundreds of people jailed. They sort of had to have a regroup, and they decided that they set up an education department, and they got Tom Barker to write. It's partly an educational text, it's partly a historical text, it's partly an awesome piece of propaganda and a handbook for the revolution in the maritime industry. And for him, he was trying to describe the one big union of the sea. But it had no author, so it took me ages to work out that it was actually Tom Barker who'd written it. And so you've got a whole scenario here where there's, Tom Barker's very, very significant here in Australia. But people sort of didn't notice what he did afterwards. But after he was deported, there were a lot of radicals deported around the First World War. This is a fine British imperial tradition, and the Australians kept it up. That was how they got rid of their foreign-born radicals. They deported them. So in 1918, Tom Barker and a whole bunch of his fellow workers were deported to Chile. And he almost stayed on the boat, but then he discovered that there were Wobblies in Chile on the Valparaiso docks, very successful ones, who had been established by maritime workers. So he landed there, didn't last very long. The Chilean government deported him, dumped him over the border into Buenos Aires, where he organised a union on the Buenos Aires docks. And it was for foreign seamen anyway. So he had lots of adventures. He was a globe-trotting agitator. But his oral history, contains an enormous amount of stuff, including all of that era and everything. But we get a lot of our history and a lot of our information from that particular oral history. And so I suppose, one of the things I would like to talk about is some of the stuff that he brings up is your history. This is the history of the Queensland Wobblies. Again, all wobbly history is hidden history. The more you look, the more you find, the more you realise that there's a whole bunch of gaps. But he does talk about two particular things, and there was a young historian up here in Queensland who argued this. Most of the history in Australia focuses on the local and the city locals. So it focuses on the Sydney local or the Melbourne local, the Brisbane local to some extent. But in Queensland, there was a huge wobbly following that very closely resembled the agricultural workers in the United States. So I don't know how much you know about them, but they were migratory workers. So they fruit picked and they went up and down the coast, and then they would log, and then they would go where the work was. There was a very similar pattern here in Australia, where you had people working their way north. So, miners would work in the mines, and then the mines would close down, and they would go up north, and they would end up in the shearing camps, and then they would fruit pick and sugar, all of those sorts of things. And all of those people, they're sort of the ideal wobbly membership in a way. They were itinerant workers. They lived together, they travelled together, they worked together, and they were very big on direct action. Direct action worked very well in those kinds of areas. So they had a huge influence in the remote parts of Queensland, which is, you've got a very big state here. And they tended to use direct action tactics in order to achieve what they wanted. And that included the go slow. They were very good at the go slow tactics. And I've read some great pamphlets where they argued that you should be kind to your animals if you were herding sheep or cattle. Being kind to your animals was a very good thing. Don't rush them. Don't let them get too hot. Make sure they can stop and drink the water, and if you're shearing in the sheds, if you're sorting the fleece, don't rush. Make sure you're doing a really good job. Make sure you pick out every piece of dirt. All of those kinds of things. And so and there's a whole area there where the concept of sabotage with the wobblies is very much misunderstood. But what you were trying to do was disrupt the production process, and without going on strike. Because if you go on strike, you don't get paid, and that's a big thing. I mean, you need a lot of preparation if you're going to go on strike. And so that brings me to another famous wobbly in Queensland from the 1960s, who seems to be one of those people who's disappeared from history, even though in his day he was enormously famous, and his name was Pat Mackey. Yeah. I'm seeing some nods. Some of you know who Pat Mackey was. Yeah, awesome. Pat Mackey was a wonderful character, and once again, we are privileged to have his oral histories, and they're right here in the University of Queensland Library, and they're all over the place. So he put together two books. Well, he spoke them. He was a much better talker than a writer, as far as I can tell. But his partner recorded them and then wrote them down, published them as books. And so he was involved in the 1964-1965 Mount Isa dispute. Yeah. So Pat Mackey was a lifelong wobbly, and there's a lot of stories around where he would pull out his red card at every opportunity to show it to people. And he discovered the wobblies and was trained in syndicalism and direct action in the Canadian Merchant Marine. And so what happened when the wobblies were persecuted out of existence after the First World War, they kind of took refuge in the maritime industry. So you see their influence very strongly in amongst dock workers, amongst wharfies. And so if you look at, and I've seen some MUA T-shirts around here, I don't know, some of you here, you can see the ongoing influence in the Waterside Workers Federation, in particular the democratic structure of their union. Yeah, and there very important lessons here were learned in Australia in particular by the Waterside Workers Federation during the First World War. So we had a different situation here. There were already industrial unions in Australia when the Wobblies got started, and they were basically political vehicles for Labor Party politicians. There was a lot of that going on. And yeah, so the Waterside Workers Federation learned some very important lessons during the First World War because they got Billy Hughes elected. Billy Hughes used the Waterside Workers Federation as a vehicle to become elected Prime Minister, and then he turned on the unions. So feel free to hiss and spit when you hear his name. That's very important. It's usually what workers will do, particularly Waterside workers. And so the Australian Wobblies had a very different experience in the United States in a lot of ways because we had the Labor Party. So we had an example, so the Wobblies here in Australia were much earlier, very anti-political, and that's probably something that all of you know a little bit about is the conflict over what's called the De Leon School and the Chicago School, and that has to do with whether the Wobblies get involved in politics or not. Here, the Wobblies went, well, we've seen what the Labor Party does, and the Labor Party is a drag on the revolution, essentially, and so they tended to side much more with the direct action school and the anti-political school, I suppose, in that way. Which is, it's one of those complicated history debates, but... and so... now I've lost track of where I was going with that. Anyway, so... I'm going to go back. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, yes. Billy Hughes. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say, was we had a model of industrial unionism here, which is, the basic principle of which is all the workers in a particular industry are all organised into the same union. Yeah, and that increases your possibilities for solidarity. The industrial unions here, there was a sort of a top-down model, and I'm also talking about the IWW, the Australian Workers Union, who are very important in Queensland history and had that same sort of top-down model. The Waterside Workers Federation countered that sort of lesson by having a very democratic, syndicalist internal structure where they could instantly recall their leaders, and they tried to keep their leaders actually on the docks where they could keep an eye on them, that sort of thing. But Pat Mackey... sorry?
They got rid of that.
They got rid of that?
They got rid of that.
You mean the Waterside Workers?
Yes.
Yes. Eventually they did. But it hung on for a long time, even into the 1950s. Even if you look at the Waterside Workers Federation disputes in the 1950s, it's remarked upon how internally democratic they were. Yes, it's definitely changed. So Pat Mackey was a direct actionist. He learned his trade in Canada and the United States, and he often, in those areas, came into conflict with the union leadership because of his direct action, because he would do what the workers wanted. He wouldn't try and manipulate the membership in favour of what the leadership wanted. So you can imagine when he came over and landed in Mount Isa and started getting involved in these disputes, the AWU didn't like him much. He ran into trouble with them a lot, but he was enormously popular on the ground and he got results. And so they kicked him out. And the company sacked him and they tried to reinstate him, but he knew that he wouldn't be reinstated. But he kept working, and he became nationally famous because he went on a fundraising tour. And I found a comment from somebody who said he was, at the time, more famous than Richie Benaud, who was the captain of the Australian cricket team at the time. So, that's a claim to fame. He got a great response. He talks about that in his autobiography as well. So there's a whole history in Australia which is quite different from the American history. There's parallels. I've been asked before: is the Australian are the Australian Wobblies an offshoot of the American branch, or were they their own organisation? And the answer is yes, kind of, to both questions. There was a New Zealand-born wobbly named William Troutman, who was instrumental in setting up the Wobblies in the United States. And just before that establishment in 1905, he came over to Australia and New Zealand and campaigned around and made sure everybody knew that was what was going on. So there were definitely connections. They kept connections all the time. Tom Barker points out that they used to import all the American literature and spread it around in Australia. So and there was a on the ground influence, because workers, this is a period of time where, historians tend to assume that national borders are real, yeah, and particularly in this era. There's this kind of assumption going on where historians look back and they, as Christopher Hill says, impose their own values on it. But this idea of, the Wobblies called it boneheaded patriotism. Yeah. This idea that land borders were something that made a difference to people is very much a post-World War I era and idea, and it partly arises from this era in the First World War, where the working class was genuinely internationalist, and that was extremely dangerous. And so by the end of the First World War, if you look at the history of the workers over the whole world, what you see is that the industrial working class everywhere was on the verge of revolution. There were mutinies going on amongst French soldiers. There were huge numbers of soldiers refusing to attack the Russian Revolution. There were in the United States in 1919, there were like 3,000 strikes. Yeah, here there was general strike after general strike. There was a shearers' strike in 1917. The Australian working class in particular got really done over by the First World War. By the end of the First World War, we were starving. There was a lot, because we have an export-driven economy. Yeah, this is always has been, still is. One of my history tutors once said to me, Australia is a country with first world living conditions and a third world economy. We are, and you still see this, we are still dependent on export. Yeah, our importers are different people. It's China now, but back then, our two biggest importers of raw materials, and I'm talking agriculture as well as mining and all that sort of stuff, was England and Germany. So as soon as England declared war on Germany, our exports to Germany dried up. Yeah, that overnight practically, and it ruined the Australian economy. So for the Wobblies here in Australia, that was an industrial issue. Yeah, and it happened all the time. And I'm not saying that the working class here in general wasn't supporting the war. Mostly they did. Yeah, even the union movement, the trade union, craft union movement, as opposed to the Wobblies. And I'm sure you all know that the union movement here opposed conscription. It wasn't on the basis of being opposed to the war. The waterside workers' unions kicked out all their German members when the war was declared. The Seamen's Union, the British Seamen's Union, had a German branch, and they kicked them all out. I found stories from Rupert Lockwood where they not only did they kick out all of their German maritime workers and officers, they kicked out all the Swedish ones as well, and the Dutch ones, because they couldn't tell the difference between a German surname and a Dutch one. Germans who'd been here for generations were persecuted. I live in Adelaide at the moment. There was a lot of that stuff going on there. It was madness, and the Wobblies thought it was madness, and Tom Barker called it childish in the extreme. And because it undermines class solidarity, right? It's a very simple thing. This is why the Wobblies are always anti-racist, because racism is a method of divide and rule. Basically that's what it comes down to. It's as simple as that. So, but the unions here, the craft unions, the trades unions, were opposed to conscription, not because they were opposed to joining the war, but because they were worried about the state having that kind of power over their members, basically. And they argued that they were volunteering that all their members were volunteering in their droves, and conscription was completely unnecessary. The Wobblies, on the other hand, were opposed to World War I as a dumb boss's war. Yeah, that it was. So James Connolly, once famously said, a bayonet is a weapon with a worker on either end. And that was the basic attitude that the Wobblies took. They got involved in the anti-conscription campaigns because that got them around the censor. You know, there was like doing anti-war stuff in a wartime environment. You know, the censor wouldn't let them print anything like that. So, but you know, they were opposed to the war too. There's any number of articles in Direct Action about boneheaded patriotism and thumb bosses wars and all that kind of thing. So yeah. So there's a whole level of history there that belongs to the Australian story that's different from the American story, even though it's connected. But all of those people were connected by their class. Well, they were all getting the class. Tom Barker calls it getting the class idea. And that's how the Wobblies spread, was on the ground amongst ordinary workers, as Bob said before, travelling from, you know, you would work in the United States till the work dried up, and then you would jump on a boat, work your passage over to New Zealand or Australia and work here. You bring the literature with you, you distribute it along the way, and that's how the connections were maintained. So, I don't know. I've probably been going on for an awfully long time here, but what I would be interested in is experiences that you guys are interested in, and also I want to say that Asger talked before about wobbly history being living history. It's your history. You know, and then, you know, Tom Barker says this as well. And, you know, part of his pamphlet is about, Roger Coates called Tom Barker the last of the self-educated workers. But he's not, you know. My father is a self-educated worker. He left school at the age of 15, but no one would call him uneducated. You know, he learned the traditional methods of workers' self-education. He read Marx's Capital. He went to study classes. Very erudite man. That's how workers, you know, there's a whole tradition that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's about you valuing your own experience and analysing it outwards from there. So I'm interested in your experiences, or everybody's experiences. You all make your own history. You know, we're not born into conditions of our choosing. But within those conditions, we make our own history.